Be seated, please. I suspect most of you know that I really don't like religious movies. When I was a kid, the Ten Commandments came out. And everybody at Sunday school and at church said, "Ooh, you have to go see it." And so we did. I thought it was long. And then there was the greatest story ever told, where every time a blonde, blue-eyed Jesus appeared on the screen, there was a light bulb off in the corner and a choir that sort of went, "Oh!" I thought it was a bit hokey. So I never liked religious movies. And then one day, my son, when he was at Temple University, a college student, called me up and said, "Dad, have you seen The Passion of Christ?" Of course I hadn't. It's the Mel Gibson movie. First of all, I'm not a fan of Mel Gibson. I mean, reputedly he said, made anti-Semitic remarks, and so therefore I'm definitely not a fan. And a lot of people criticized. But I listened to this son who was so excited about this. He says, "I thought it was great." He says, from him I learned that it was in another language, Aramaic as it turns out, ancient, the Assyrian language. And he had to read subtitles, but he said, "Dad, some of those subtitles I didn't even have to read because I just knew what they were saying." And I said, "Paul, you've been to Stations of the Cross once too often, But he knew he knew it, and so finally, because your son says this, and college student says this, I'm going to go and see this movie. And I have to tell you, this was the only religious movie I've ever seen that I actually approved of. Because it really stuck to the Bible, for the most part. There was one little ad-lib about Pilate's wife, but after all, I had to give her more than one line after all. But because in the actual gospel, she only has one line. But that was the only thing. But it was fairly close to the actual scriptural account of the crucifixion. I liked it. And then I began to read people's reviews of this, and it turns out that people would say things like, "Oh, it was so violent. Oh, why did it have to be so brutal? It was a terrible show of blood and awful stuff. You can't take your children to that." And I'm thinking, hold on, people. Stop. This is crucifixion we're talking about. You can't make it nice. This is really ugly stuff. I mean, look. They snatched Jesus out of a place where he was in private with his disciples because they couldn't do it in the crowd when others might stand up to protect him. So in the middle of the night, they came and they snatched him. They put him in some holding tank somewhere until they could call together their council. And when they came, and while he was there, they treated him with mocking, with brutality, beating, presumably. I presume all that's covered under the word scourging, which was the old biblical word. They get together their council and desperately try to find something wrong with him, something they could pin on him, and they can't do it. So a little more beating, a little more rough stuff, probably blood drawn. You don't think you could, put a crown of thorns on someone's head without seeing blood somewhere. It was brutal, and they took him to Pilate with trumped up charges, but they couldn't prove anything, and even Pilate kind of knew this. But he, desiring to keep the peace and slough off responsibility, sent him over to Herod. And Herod's people, had more beating and more torture and more humiliation and laughter and gloating over his suffering, as people do. This is nasty stuff. And then finally Pilate caves in. They're so eager to have an insurrectionist murderer released that he finally gives it to them what they want, and he lets them take Jesus off, and dragging his cross until they finally give it to Simon of Cyrene, and they get him and of course nailing him to the cross would not have been a pleasant thing. Hanging him up, standing that cross up, I'm told that what happens is you basically sag down and you're unable to breathe, and you just slowly suffocate while you're there in the hot sun, with the humiliation of everybody there jeering and sneering and doing whatever they please. This is not a beautiful thing that we celebrate today. I know it's easy to come to Palm Sunday and do the palm part. You know, there's a kind of hopeful triumphalism as the children sing, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. There's a wonderful hopeful triumphalism. That's easy. But the rest of Holy Week is about this suffering, and it is not pretty. It's not a beautiful sight. But this is what we're asked to embrace in Holy Week. The suffering, the passion of our Lord Jesus Christ. It means his suffering, his bloody, brutal suffering. To embrace it and take it on as something of our own, as something that we can identify with. But it's not just a pious exercise of thinking about dear old Jesus, you know, who suffered all that stuff back then. Jesus is the one who, after all, said, if you do it to the least of these, my brothers or sisters, you do it to me. And this sort of stuff exists now. It has always existed somewhere in the world, all the time, because there's a flaw in human nature, a flaw of man's own choosing, of the choosing of individual men and women to do the wrong thing, but it's there. And we have it amongst us now. All I have to do is mention the word Gaza, I think you know what I mean, Ukraine, the indiscriminate bombing and maiming of children, and any kind of terrorist action at all. All you have to do is mention it, and we know what it involves. It involves a brutality, a brutishness, a nastiness, an unfeeling, lack of caring for other people's suffering. And there's often gloating. To see it in our own country, to see men who were picked up because they had tattoos and were probably the wrong color, and were put into chains so that they had to creep crawl onto an aeroplane, which flew them to a foreign gulag where they will probably die. And then to see the director of our Homeland Security standing there photographing in front of a caged group of shaven men looking absolutely despondent and miserable, her gloating over it like she was some star in an underground sadomasochist movie. I mean, this is not just angering, not just disgusting, but it's absolutely outrageous. This is the passion of Christ. This is what Jesus went through. And when he says in another place in the Gospels, as you treat what you do unto anyone, you do it to me, this is what he means. Holy Week is definitely the time for us to embrace the passion of Christ, to embrace that suffering, to recognize that it's not good, put it as mildly as I can, it's not good to gloat over people who are suffering. It's not good to build our future on the misery of others. It's never good. And we are the people who understand this because we see what Jesus has done. We see what he endured and what the life that he calls us to in his kingdom. And we recognize that we don't represent that stuff. It is not who we are. If we seriously embrace the suffering of Jesus, the passion of Christ, if we seriously take it on as our own, then we've got to say that gloating over people's misery, of building our futures on other people's pain, of causing other people's pain in brutish behavior or words, this is not us. This is not who we are. In the Old Testament, in the book of Joshua, son of Nun, who became the leader of the Hebrew people after Moses died, and who is going to lead them to the promised land, lead them across the Jordan to the promised land. He says to them, look, I offer you two choices. There's two choices out there. You can follow the way of selfishness. You can follow the way of sinfulness, of thinking about nobody but yourself. That's the way of death. You can follow that. Or you can follow the Lord. And then he says to them this, and this is the question: choose this day whom you will serve. But as for me and my family, we will serve the Lord. That's the question I think should be on our minds, in our hearts, in Holy Week, as we embrace the passion, the suffering of Jesus Christ. The end of the day, choose this day whom you will serve.